the bomb.
All right, we're going to show some of the news from from ABC, NBC, and CBS. But tonight's program really is about this right here: Los Alamos burns. According to watchdog groups in New Mexico, there are buried sites from the 1940s to the present all around Los Alamos that are burning. There is a potential for radioactive particulates to be in the air and to blow our way into our city. I cannot get a response thus far from Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center, from the Sheriff's Department, from any of our emergency people or safety people. And those that I have talked to said they have absolutely no contingency plans for anything such as a nuclear burn and the wind blowing this way. There is nothing monitoring the air that I have heard of. They said there were some plans for Rocky Flats if there was a nuclear fire of some type, but at least to alert people. But basically right now, I'm the only one in the media in Boulder or in Denver who's talking about this issue, and you are on your own. Of course, in Boulder, we've always been on our own because we've had Rocky Flats lying to us through their teeth for the past 50 or 60 years, so we know we can't trust those people. You certainly probably can trust the watchdog groups in New Mexico, and Los Alamos is how far from us? What, 400 miles, 300 and something miles? Not very damn far. Chernobyl was played down at the very beginning. This thing is not even being mentioned on the national news as far as those waste dumps, which means that the government is burying this story. Talk radio's not even talking about it. I mean, not even KGNU, as far as I know, or KWAB. I think it's serious enough that we should look at it, because if there are nuclear particulates in the air and they are threatening us, people that live here in Boulder, Jesus, it doesn't take much, does it? Just one little breeze, enough, the highest amount of rads that you need, and we've got a big problem for the entire population. Jan Scott, Los Alamos burns, some of the news media coming up. We'll show you some of the weather patterns, how the wind blows, and I'll try to feed you as much information on this as I can, and this will be playing over the next weekend. The jaw line is up. You can call in with any updated information you may have on any information, what contingencies are in place for the city of Boulder. I have not been able to find, and I've got the only live call-in. It's not live anymore because of the idiots that run CATV in our fair city. When you need a program like this to be able to go on live, we've got the damn thing involved in fascist politics, which is not to your health or to mine, but it's the main reason I do this program, so we can cover late-breaking, important issues that affect all of us, and this is one damn big one, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, Los Alamos burns, not good.
This is the CBS Evening News, with Dan Rather reporting from CBS News headquarters in New York.
Good evening. Hundreds of homes have been damaged or destroyed by the firestorm still sweeping Los Alamos, New Mexico. The fire zone includes the nation's biggest nuclear weapons lab. The government insists all hazardous materials are secured. Even from high up in space, the fire's intensity is clear. Los Alamos itself is a ghost town tonight. All 11,000 residents evacuated. 7,000 more were forced to flee suburban White Rock, New Mexico this morning. The huge smoke plume drifted all the way to Oklahoma and Texas. Firefighters are up against high winds, low water pressure, and endless dry acres waiting to burn. Late today, an airplane said to have been involved in trying to fight the fires crashed in northeastern New Mexico, touching off yet another fire. CBS's Maureen Maher is in the hellfire of Los Alamos. Maureen?
Dan, it was a long, hard day for firefighters, choked by thick black smoke and frustrated by those driving winds behind these two enormous fires. It was tough for anyone to make any progress. Like a fast-moving train, the first fire roared through the north end of Los Alamos, slowing down just long enough to engulf one home before moving on to another. On this block, more than a half-dozen homes were lost in minutes.
It started way up there on the other street, and they've letting it just run straight through. I don't even see them protecting any of these houses.
Some tried to battle the blaze on their own, but most of the 11,000 residents left late yesterday when they saw the fire in the Santa Fe National Forest, set to control the underbrush, had jumped the canyon and was heading into town. In less than 5 hours, it consumed 15,000 acres and damaged or destroyed more than 300 homes.
We've got plenty of water, got plenty of tankers out here, but there's no relief from the wind on the top of the mountain.
Shifting 40-mile-an-hour winds fueled a second fire on the south side of town, forcing 7,000 more evacuations. It seemed firefighters had everything working against them and nothing for them.
We didn't have water up until about probably 3 hours ago. All of our hydrants went dry because the electrical system went down yesterday.
From the ground and from the air, nearly 1,000 firefighters worked to undo what Mother Nature seemed bent on doing.
Mother Nature can humble us, and this is one of those cases where Mother Nature is completely in control.
Except at the Los Alamos National Lab, which employs most of this town. Energy Secretary Bill Richardson said everything was under control.
Our extensive nuclear materials throughout the complex are safe.
And while no one ever expected an inferno of this magnitude, many said if it was going to happen, this was the season for it.
It's springtime and we're just going to get it. That's all there is to it.
Yes. Yes, and we have just found out that the man who was in charge of Bandelier National Mountain, Roy Weaver, has been placed on leave. You can see the smoke behind me. Both fires continue to burn out of control, and the conditions are not expected to get any better until the weekend. Dan?
Maureen Maher in Los Alamos. The Los Alamos trial by fire began with a fire set deliberately by the National Park Service to burn off brush and, they thought, reduce the fire hazard. Now there are accusations of possible gross miscalculation or outright bungling. CBS News correspondent Bob McNamara, one of our most experienced hands, has been carefully investigating this part of the story.
Controlled burns are an inexact science. The fires are set to burn away tinder-dry underbrush that, if ignited, perhaps by lightning, could fuel an even fiercer firestorm. But controlled burns work only in ideal weather conditions. The day this fire exploded into a disaster, this Weather Service forecast warned fire crews that atmospheric conditions were at their worst for a controlled burn. Still, the fires were set.
They say hindsight is 20/20. I'm sure you hear that all the time. And the people ask me, gosh, would you do this again? And I'd say, well, if I knew this was going to happen, of course not.
It's not so much how dry it is that can make a controlled burn turn devastating. It's the wind that's the wild card. And this is the windiest and driest time of year. And why that combination was never more cautiously considered is the most burning question of all.
There needs to be an investigation. I think I share the concern that everybody shares. I mean, what has happened here that's allowed this to happen?
I would like to hear the justification for this one.
Peggy Millette and her family loaded everything from pillows to pets and evacuated the fire zone.
I'm not angry, but I'm incredibly hurt because it's such an incredible, beautiful place.
Dan Luman was leaving too.
Yeah, I guess we'll go and leave it in the good Lord's hands, so I think that's where it's going to end up anyway, so.
Tonight, many here find themselves helpless in a hopeless situation, and knowing it all probably could have been avoided. Bob McNamara, CBS News, Los Alamos.
Even before Los Alamos, fires fueled by La Nina-driven winds and drought in the southwest and in other parts of the country had already consumed 1,200 square miles nationwide. And, mark it, it is still early in the U.S. brush fire season. For 8 days now, the fires have been raging in Los Alamos, burning more than 18,000 acres. And now officials fear it might just be the start of something much worse. At the National Interagency Fire Center in Boise, Idaho, they're monitoring fire risk, and they don't like what they see.
In the big picture, I'd say this is probably, for the Southwest, one of their potentially worst fire seasons in the last 30 years.
Rick Ochoa is a fire weather meteorologist. He says in some parts of the country there will be big trouble if the fuse is lit.
It is very bad. In the Southwest, we have very dry conditions, windy, low humidity. It's the worst of all possible conditions.
The culprit, the infamous La Nina, which has cooled Pacific waters, shifting the jet stream and rain northward, leaving a dry, high-pressure system stranded over the southwest United States. The result, a sun-baked tinderbox throughout the Southwest. Montana and Florida are also vulnerable.
And it's a recipe for a big fire.
Hello?
Hey, George?
Yeah.
Jan Scott here. Sorry to call you at home.
Hey, how you doing?
Pretty good. Hey, I'm calling you about the fire down in Los Alamos. I'm doing a special television program on it, and I was a little concerned about the. There are some watchdogs that's saying that there's nuclear waste buried around there, and that it's already burning. And I was looking at some of the weather maps that show that occasionally the winds blow up through Colorado. In fact, they already blow through the south. They're blowing through the southeast now. And I was kind of wondering what we had in Boulder County to monitor against any nuclear waste burning. You know, that might. Do we have any way to detect that, or are there any plans, or are we?
You know, we got Rocky Flats right next door, so.
Yeah.
It's something we talk about all the time. We do regular exercises and drills on different types of incidents.
What about this particular fire? Have we got anybody monitoring this right now?
In terms of radioactivity coming up here.
Yeah.
No, because the winds are prevailing westerlies, and that's what 500 miles due south of us.
Yeah, and they're blowing from the west to the east, right?
Those are the prevailing winds. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I thought I would ask because there's a the news isn't talking about this, although there is a group in Albuquerque, New Mexico, in Oregon. It's a research center. It's a nuclear safety research center, and they're saying that they've got nuclear wastes buried all over Los Alamos since the 1940s in the Manhattan Project, and this stuff's already burning. I mean, the plant is already burned, even though the explosion.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, just from what I've read on the internet today, and I know about that, some of the grasslands were probably burned over.
In the canyons.
That had some low levels of radioactivity on them, and that some of that stuff probably went up in the air. And there was even an estimate. Look at the Santa Fe, New Mexican's website. That's where I was reading.
Okay, the Santa Fe, what is it called?
It's the Santa Fe, New Mexican.
Santa Fe, New Mexican.
Yeah.
So you've been monitoring this then. So you've been thinking about nuclear stuff in the air.
Well,
or not?
I think I read it before I was thinking about it.
Yeah.
I mean, I thought about it, but I was curious to see what was going on down there.
Well, like in Chernobyl and places like that, I mean, they underplayed it so much, and the fact that the news media hasn't talked about any of this, except for the Rocky Mountain News, they're the only ones. I'm like, I wonder if the federal government is spinning this. They don't want people to think about that maybe some poorly buried nuclear wastes might get hot enough and forest fire.
They actually had, in that Santa Fe, New Mexican article, which I looked at earlier this afternoon, they had, from the Los Alamos labs, they had estimates of how much radiation was released. It was like 1,000 millirems down, within 100 meters downrange of downwind of where the stuff was, which is like 3 times the annual dose that you just get from being out in the sun and stuff.
Okay, so that's not very much.
It's not much, but you don't want to do it every day.
Yeah. No. Well, no, but that's kind of my concern. It's like, how hot is this thing? I mean, the fire's out of control, and what's
And my understanding is the fire has burned over the labs. Fires.
Yeah.
Like a wind-driven fire, there's a fairly narrow band of active fire, and it moves along at some speed that's determined by the wind and the fuel moisture and the availability of fuels.
Well,
it burned through the lab yesterday.
You're talking about the crowns of the trees, or the fact that it's 50 miles an hour wind, so it would burn at roughly that speed.
If they're trees, it's burned through the crowns of the trees. If it's grassland, it's burned through the grass. If it's subdivisions, it's burning through the houses.
Well, I've been to Los Alamos. I mean, the plateau itself is mostly grasslands, but there's all forest all around it. My real worry was, where the heck did they bury stuff, in the 40s and 50s, and how deep did they bury it, and the fact that it was never removed, and this group is saying that the people that run Los Alamos, I mean, they have no idea how much is buried there, where it's buried, or what the effects could be, or what the radiation levels are. So what I'm thinking. Well, what brings to my mind is 3 Mile Island in Chernobyl, and my big question is, in Boulder, let's just say worst possible scenario, that all this stuff's not very, very deep, and it gets airborne and causes a heck of a problem. And I guess what I'm wondering is what kind of precautions do we have in our community, seeing the fact that we live 15 miles from Rocky Flats? Do we have any system that monitors the air, or if there were a problem that people would be alerted immediately, or what would they do?
We have plans. We exercise them regularly.
Yeah.
We have Larry Stern spends half his life doing that.
I know. Well, I don't mean to bug you at home, but I thought this was important, because I don't want to wake up tomorrow morning and find out that we got radiation all over the damn place, and my job is to talk to people and let them know here are some things that you maybe should think about.
Definitely things to think about. Yep.
But no action at this point?
Well, not from us, I don't think. I was kind of surprised to see that one article, and I don't know if you're on the internet, you might want to take a look at it.
Yeah, I am. The Santa Fe, New Mexican.
Yeah.
Well, I don't have it, but I do have the Rocky Mountain News here. And, this guy says, he says one thing. It's, where the heck is it? His name is Hancock, and he's the director of the Nuclear Waste Safety Program at Southwest Research and Information Center in Albuquerque. Says the fire poses unusual dangers in an area littered with radioactive material. And it was that sentence plus a few others, and where he says, literally nobody, including the people at Los Alamos, know how much radioactive material is scattered around, and has been scattered around for the past 55 years since the beginning of the Manhattan Project. So that kind of got me thinking, and I thought, well, what the heck do we have? That's a hot fire.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the other thing that surprised, it says it's exploding houses, so I'm like, oh. Anyway, so is there anybody, do we have any kind of system that monitors the amount of radioactivity in our air near here on a regular basis, or only when we think that we need to do it, or what?
I can't really answer that. I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'd ask if,
Call Larry Stern?
Ask Larry.
All right. Well, maybe I'll call him and ask him.
Okay.
I mean, do you think I'm being reasonable here in examining all of this at this point with this fire burning down there?
Well.
Or do you think I'm being alarmist?
It's 500 miles away, so.
300. It's only 380 or 350, isn't it?
Oh, I don't know. I just drove down there over spring break. It seemed like 500. Maybe it's only 380, but it's a ways.
Okay. All right, George. Well, thanks.
Wind doesn't blow that way. I mean, the prevailing winds are westerly, so the people who.
Yeah, the Panhandle and.
Texas Panhandle and Oklahoma and a lot of ranch land in New Mexico to the east of that. It's pretty sparsely populated.
outside. No, I know that's true.
You know, one of the things we do when we do our tabletop exercises at Rocky Flats is we have software that we feed in the prevailing winds and the estimated spill, and it draws a plume for us.
A plume?
A plume of where.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
Where the radioactivity might go and how dense it would be in various areas, stuff like that. Yeah, I'm sure they probably do the same thing down there.
Well, now we've got a chance to see just who's doing what, I guess. You know, I mean, if we already have a bit of...
I guess I'm not sure. That was not a good statement. I'm not sure they do that, but I would expect that they do.
Well, you know, it's like, I don't know. I mean, you know, of course I was alive when Chernobyl happened and 3 Mile Island and all of that, and I don't know. God knows what the heck happened out at Rocky Flats. I mean, we know that we had a runaway grand jury out there because they were trying to hide safety information from the public. So we already know how the nuclear agencies operate. They're not exactly forthcoming.
I think that would be an accurate statement.
So, assuming that these people in Los Alamos are lying through their teeth at this point.
What's the worst case?
Well, yeah, actually, what is the worst case? Well, what is the worst case?
Well, the worst case is that smoke cloud has got a lot of radioactivity in it.
Well, now there was smoke in Denver. They measured smoke from the fire in Denver yesterday, which means it came here. You could smell, pine smoke in Denver yesterday. So.
But, my daughter told me I shouldn't see any sign of it here, but maybe maybe just wasn't paying attention.
Maybe somebody should look into this, and we ought to turn on some equipment to find out if we do have any radioactive. I mean, hopefully it's nothing or not much, but I mean, God knows what they buried down there in the. You know what I'm talking about? They weren't exactly on top of it. They didn't even know what they were dealing with in the 40s.
Yeah, it was the Cold War. They had to. I know my dad was a Cold Warrior.
He was involved in that stuff.
Oh yeah, he worked at Rocky Flats. Helped open the plant until he retired. He worked there.
Well, I knew guys that worked in the Manhattan Project. They're all dead now, but they were in the 80s. They were, they were in their 80s, and I don't know what they did down there. See, that's the whole thing. I mean, God knows what level of plutonium or nuclear waste that they just buried 2 or 3 or 4 feet or 6 feet underground that might get heated. Although that's
well, the good news is this kind of fire. When it moves quickly over the land.
Yeah.
And it doesn't. It'll. The most intense fire of this kind will only cook down 4 or 5 inches.
Oh. Well, that's good.
Because when it's wind driven like this, the heat goes in the direction of the wind rather than down.
Well, so we're lucky they didn't bury this stuff in the trees, in the crowns of the trees.
Yeah.
I know.
But if the stuff is buried in the ground, or if it's allowed to leach into soil, and then grasses, brush grow up, the grasses and brush burn, then stuff goes in the air.
Well, I will let you go.
Okay.
All right. Hey, thank you very much for talking to me. Okay, bye. That's George Epp, our sheriff. And,
And now, ladies and gentlemen, it's Jann Scott, the Bomb!
Coming up on Bogon. The detection station on Bogon appears to be in good shape. No visible sign of plywood tube. All test islands seem to be swept clean. Ugilab is completely gone. Nothing there but water and what appears to be a deep crater.
In the spring of 1953, the Atomic Energy Commission and the Department of Defense conducted 11 nuclear weapon tests in Nevada under the code name Upshot Knothole. The objectives of Upshot Knothole were to test new nuclear devices, improve battlefield tactics, and to study the needs of civil defense against a Soviet attack.
The first of the events, codenamed Encore, was a 27-kiloton nuclear device airdropped and detonated at about 2,800 feet above a large blast line. The second Department of Defense burst, called Grable, was detonated at the same general area, and it was delivered by the Army's new artillery cannon. A 280 millimeter projectile was fired and detonated over about the same blast area with a yield of about 15 kilotons at an altitude of about 500 feet. Now, the smaller yield, 15 kilotons at 500 feet, produced a great deal more damage than had the larger yield Encore event, 27 kilotons at 2,800 feet. And that's because the smaller yield at the lower altitude produced a very abnormal waveform, which we call a precursor, which is very strong dynamic winds, which to drag-sensitive targets produces extensive damage. For instance, a Jeep at a given level on Encore may not have been damaged at all. But on Grable, with a precursor loading, that Jeep would be completely torn to pieces and thrown down the blast line distances like 500 feet. Well, there were many other peculiarities to those two shots, but it opened up a whole new vista of how do you use nuclear weapons in a combat situation.
sense tells you this is dangerous and foolish. You wouldn't risk your neck in a trick like this. Common sense tells us that being shot out of a cannon is dangerous business. Common sense tells you not to be careless at an airfield with propellers and jet engines in action. Handling dynamite. This too looks dangerous, but it's an everyday job to these men because they observe common sense safety precautions. But sometimes we forget that security violations can be dangerous business too. If classified information about this test mission fell into enemy hands, the consequences could be disastrous to all of us, individually and collectively as a nation. Security is only common sense. Don't take chances. Avoid loose talk. Safeguard classified information. Report security violations at once. Prompt action may prevent a minor incident from developing into a serious one. Avoid writing about classified material in letters home. Be sure you're secure. Don't be careless.
I hate a careless man.
Work on high-yield hydrogen bombs had progressed from Operation Ivy, culminating in the spring of 1954 with Castle Bravo, the largest device ever detonated in atmospheric testing by the United States. Bravo was a hydrogen bomb using solid thermonuclear fuel, confirming the designs of Edward Teller and Stan Ulam, and paving the way to producing aircraft-deliverable hydrogen bombs and more effective weapons.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, it's Jann Scott, the bomb!
What's the fire danger right now here?
Fire danger is considered moderate to high around the entire state of Colorado. That includes the mountains and out onto the plains of our state. A cold front that moved through here in the last 24 hours didn't do too much to us. But the biggest danger, of course, is down in New Mexico, and the wind is the concern. 20 to 45 mile per hour winds are continuing in that area right now with 50-mile-an-hour gusts, and of course near the fire it makes its own weather, so those gusts are going over 60 miles an hour in the fire scene itself, and of course that wind is going to be shifting and moving around to the northwest. If they get lucky there, it'll blow some of the fire back onto itself a little bit later on tonight. Our wind is going to remain quite strong from time to time. We have pretty much the same weather regime that they have down there, so until a spark comes up and starts something here in Colorado, we just sit and wait. and hope that we're not going to get anything in the way of fire here in our state. New Mexico should be a good example of us being real careful with fire around here.
Terrorizing the home of America's top nuclear weapons lab, something not even the Russians were able to accomplish at the height of the Cold War. Los Alamos, New Mexico is virtually a ghost town as the wildfires rage, burning hundreds of homes. 11,000 people have been evacuated from the community, which is located on a high mesa north of Santa Fe. NBC's George Lewis is on the scene tonight.
Los Alamos, surrounded by fire tonight. The flames kicked up by high winds, consuming everything in their path. More than 100 houses destroyed so far, 300 to 400 others damaged. Overnight, growing from a 3,700-acre blaze to 20,000 acres and still spreading. This photograph from a NOAA weather satellite shows both the flames and the huge plume of smoke moving from northern New Mexico into Colorado, Texas, and Oklahoma. Today, the fire roars through the canyons around Los Alamos, forcing the evacuation of 18,000 people who live in the city and the surrounding areas. Another concern, the fire has burned into the complex housing the Los Alamos National Laboratory, birthplace of the atomic bomb. Although flames have damaged buildings in the complex, officials say the areas where plutonium and high explosives are stored are safe. But some anti-nuclear groups are worried.
Main concerns are health of firefighters, burning of contaminated soil, and explosion of tanks of chemicals that might be in the path of the flames.
Like many fast-moving forest fires, this one is hit and miss. Here, a destroyed house. Next door to it, one completely untouched by the flames. Weary fire crews try to save as many homes as they can. This group of volunteer firefighters has been going almost non-stop for 28 hours. Volunteer Fire Chief Luis Jaramillo says the wind is the biggest headache for his men.
The wind, being that the wind will pick up the hot embers and take them to another house and start another house on fire.
The fire started a week ago when the U.S. Park Service overlooked warnings about the wind danger and began a controlled burn to clear brush out of a canyon. It quickly got out of control.
I would think that the person in charge of the Park Service here that authorized this is most responsible for this.
We have to look in to see what the real facts are and what the responsibility of the government is.
When asked what the fire might do next, one official said, anything it wants. George Lewis, NBC News, Los Alamos, New Mexico.
David and Kim Hallowell are two of the victims of this disaster. David, a scientist at the Los Alamos lab, and Kim, pregnant with the couple's 6th child, are in a shelter in Santa Fe. They have no idea if they'll have a home to go back to tonight. Here they are in their own words.
It looked like it was sunset because everything was just orange everywhere because the smoke was just so thick. And there were sirens everywhere, and it took about an hour to get out of town. Usually takes 5 minutes, took about an hour. Right now we're assuming that we don't have a house because most of the houses there were burned.
I had seen some scenes on TV. It's still a very emotional time, and sometimes when I see houses burning, I get very emotional. Right now I think we're living moment to moment, making sure the kids have food and a place to sleep. There's no rule book on how to deal with this, I guess. We've never done this before. And we're trying to let go of the material things. And that's not as hard. The computer, I'm not worried about. It's the things on the wall that my mom made, or a picture that, oh, I wish I'd grabbed that off the wall. It's hindsight. I guess I'm very thankful that we're just all out here and we're safe and we're together. We have a very strong faith, and I really believe that's going to help us through this time.
David and Kim Hallowell of Los Alamos in their own words tonight. As you might expect, the origin of that fire, which was deliberately set by the National Park Service to clear brush, that's getting a lot of attention. As NBC's Robert Hager reports now, it went wrong from the moment it started and quickly became much worse.
Setting a fire to carefully burn off brush and grass so it doesn't fuel an accidental forest fire later isn't as outlandish as it sounds. Many call it good land management. So what went wrong in New Mexico? Two major problems last week as the National Park Service sets this one, intending to burn off just one small corner of Bandelier National Monument. Problem one, the official forecast faxed by the Weather Service to the park before the fire is set. It warns of a 6, highest on the scale of 1 to 6, for the potential for winds and flames to shoot upwards, and warns the winds will increase. Problem 2, not enough backup. When the fire first begins spreading much faster than intended, park employees say they make a 3:30 a.m. call to the Forest Service, supposed to be standing by, but say the dispatcher tells them call back in daylight during business hours. Today, the Forest Service says it's unexpected weather that's mostly to blame.
We lost this fire. The wind blew us out. This was a weather event. There's not a thing we could have done that would have prevented this.
Whatever happened, instead of burning this as intended, the fire is now burned to Los Alamos and the edge of the weapons laboratory. Here in Washington, an investigation is promised. Meantime, it's a fire burning so wildly, it defies traditional means of fighting. Normal ways slow down a fire with chemicals and clear a path way out ahead to set what's called a backfire, burning back into the oncoming blaze, as a specialist explains.
We would light this and let it burn down so that it widened the fire line, so as the approaching fire came, it would run out of fuel and go out.
But in Los Alamos, too fierce to try that.
Very powerful, very wind-driven, and moving very fast. So you work the edges of the fire and continue to make progress on the edges until the weather provides you the opportunity to turn the corner, so to speak, and start fighting the fire at the head.
A fire first set to be controlled, long since out of control, and now no one can stop it. Robert Hager, NBC News, Washington.
Still ahead tonight, a mother's crusade.
Fire teams are constantly getting better help. The latest, powerful satellite imaging systems to help plan and predict controlled fires.
From the imagery, we can derive information about the kinds of fire fuels that exist on the landscape, the different kinds of vegetation. Using that information, we can input it into a computer model that will then simulate how a fire will burn.
But no matter how advanced the new scientific tools become, they make little difference unless fire managers use them wisely. The question now in New Mexico is whether they did. Bill Blakemore, ABC News.
At the Interior Department, they're obviously reassessing the procedure for starting fires. They do want to reinforce two ideas. First, they estimate that only about 1% of fires they start actually get out of control. And two, they interfere with nature because they fear an even greater conflagration if they do not. In the other news today,
and why this could be one of the worst fire seasons ever in the Southwest. Protesters demand Elian Gonzalez.
This is the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather reporting from CBS News headquarters in New York.
Good evening. Hundreds of homes have been damaged or destroyed by the firestorm still sweeping Los Alamos, New Mexico. The fire zone includes the nation's biggest nuclear weapons lab. The government insists all hazardous materials are secured. Even from high up in space, the fire's intensity is clear. Los Alamos itself is a ghost town tonight. All 11,000 residents evacuated. 7,000 more were forced to flee suburban White Rock, New Mexico this morning. The huge smoke plume drifted all the way to Oklahoma and Texas. Firefighters are up against high winds, low water pressure, and endless dry acres waiting to burn. Late today, an airplane said to have been involved in trying to fight the fires crashed in northeastern New Mexico, touching off yet another fire. CBS's Maureen Maher is in the hellfire of Los Alamos. Maureen?
Dan, it was a long, hard day for firefighters, choked by thick black smoke and frustrated by those driving winds behind these two enormous fires. It was tough for anyone to make any progress. Like a fast-moving train, the first fire roared through the north end of Los Alamos, slowing down just long enough to engulf one home before moving on to another. On this block, more than a half dozen homes were lost in minutes.
It started way up there on the other street, and they've letting it just run straight through. I don't even see them protecting any of these houses.
Some tried to battle the blaze on their own, but most of the 11,000 residents left late yesterday when they saw the fire in the Santa Fe National Forest, set to control the underbrush, had jumped the canyon and was heading into town. In less than 5 hours, it consumed 15,000 acres and damaged or destroyed more than 300 homes.
You got plenty of water, got plenty of tankers out here, but there's no relief from the wind on the top of the mountain.
Shifting 40-mile-an-hour winds fueled a second fire on the south side of town, forcing 7,000 more evacuations. It seemed firefighters had everything working against them and nothing for them.
We didn't have water up until about probably 3 hours ago. All of our hydrants went dry because the electrical system went down yesterday.
From the ground and from the air, nearly 1,000 firefighters worked to undo what Mother Nature seemed bent on doing.
Mother Nature can humble us, and this is one of those cases where Mother Nature is completely in control.
Except at the Los Alamos National Lab, which employs most of this town. Energy Secretary Bill Richardson said everything was under control.
Our extensive nuclear materials throughout the complex are safe.
And while no one ever expected an inferno of this magnitude, many said if it was going to happen, this was the season for it.
It's springtime and we're just going to get it. That's all there is to it.
Yes, yes, and we have just found out that the man who was in charge of Bandelier National Mountain, Roy Weaver, has been placed on leave. You can see the smoke behind me. Both fires continue to burn out of control, and the conditions are not expected to get any better until the weekend. Dan?
Maureen Maher in Los Alamos. The Los Alamos trial by fire began with a fire set deliberately by the National Park Service to burn off brush and, they thought, reduce the fire hazard. Now there are accusations of possible gross miscalculation or outright bungling. CBS News correspondent Bob McNamara, one of our most experienced hands, has been carefully investigating this part of the story.
Controlled burns are an inexact science. The fires are set to burn away tinder dry underbrush that, if ignited, perhaps by lightning, could fuel an even fiercer firestorm. But controlled burns work only in ideal weather conditions. The day this fire exploded into a disaster, this Weather Service forecast warned fire crews that atmospheric conditions were at their worst for a controlled burn. Still, the fires were set.
They say hindsight is 20/20. I'm sure you hear that all the time. And the people ask me, gosh, would you do this again? And I'd say, well, if I knew this was going to happen, of course not.
It's not so much how dry it is that can make a controlled burn turn devastating. It's the wind that's the wild card. And this is the windiest and driest time of year. And why that combination was never more cautiously considered is the most burning question of all.
There needs to be an investigation. I think I share the concern that everybody shares. I mean, what has happened here that's allowed this to happen?
I would like to hear the justification for this one.
Peggy Millette and her family loaded everything from pillows to pets and evacuated the fire zone.
I'm not angry, but I'm incredibly hurt because it's such an incredible, beautiful place.
Dan Luman was leaving too.
Yeah, I guess we'll go and leave it in the good Lord's hands, so I think that's where it's going to end up anyway, so.
Tonight, many here find themselves helpless in a hopeless situation, and knowing it all probably could have been avoided. Bob McNamara, CBS News, Los Alamos.
Even before Los Alamos, fires fueled by La Nina-driven winds and drought in the southwest and in other parts of the country had already consumed 1,200 square miles nationwide. And, mark it, it is still early in the U.S. brush fire season.
Remember, one of those fingers, is just chock full of waste. They have pits that are about 65 feet deep, just filled with waste. And then in between each of these deep 65-foot pits, they sink wells where they have essentially put high-level waste. And then they have transuranic waste buried in some of those pits. They have low-level and what's known as transuranic. The transuranic waste is the stuff that they say needs to go down to the waste isolation pilot plant, WIP, which is about a half mile below the ground. Well, for years they've just been putting that stuff, so high plutonium content waste, in these 65-foot pits, which come right up to the surface.
They come up to the surface.
That's
because
right.
Because fires, incidentally, we're talking with Tom Marshall with Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center. He's the Peace and Justice Center's expert on nuclear waste. He's familiar with Los Alamos. I talked with Sherriff George Epp, which we're going to hear in a little while, and he told me that when you have hot fires that burn at a high rate of speed, that the heat doesn't get below 6 inches below the ground. But some nuclear waste has burned already, because according to the Santa Fe Journal or Santa Fe newspaper, if you go to their website, they've already measured REMs there that are 3 times the normal, and we don't know, what else is burned or what else is in our sky here in Boulder. We do know that as of yesterday, even though we have westerly prevailing winds, smoke made it up as far as Boulder and Denver, and you could smell it here. So, I'm wondering what the hell is going on. Tom Brokaw made a cryptic statement tonight that even the Soviets, in their worst possible days of managing nuclear facilities, never did anything like this. So what does he know that we don't know? And what are...
Well, one thing everybody should understand is that when we hear about the town of Los Alamos burning, the town of Los Alamos actually runs through the weapons laboratory.
Yeah.
So if the town of Los Alamos is burning, that means that part of the lab is burning, and of course that is known at this point that part of the lab is burning. Evidently, a research building that had radioactive and hazardous materials in it was actually singed the other day, and it was not, it wasn't breached, but that is certainly a possibility.
Something's been, okay, technical area 16 has burned already. Okay, but it's a bunker. They say they're saying that all the plutonium and all the explosives that are in there are protected. But let me ask you something, Tom. This is an active nuclear weapons facility, right?
It's an active nuclear weapons facility. It's where they moved the operations. The Los Alamos National Laboratory is where where the bomb was developed. It's been in operation. It was one of the original Manhattan Project facilities, so it's been in operation since the early 40s, and they are continuing to build components for nuclear weapons there. They have moved the operations that used to exist at Rocky Flats to Los Alamos, so there is a considerable amount of plutonium, other radioactive materials, and hazardous materials at the site. And since the 1940s, they have been doing various amounts of production and research work there.
No.
There's a lot of waste buried, and the site is a contaminated site.
Okay, when do they stop burying waste there?
They're continuing to bury waste at the site.
They are. Well, according to this man, Don Hancock, Director of Nuclear Waste Safety Program at Southwest Research and Information Center in Albuquerque, he says the fire poses unusual dangers in an area littered with radioactive material, and that they've been burying it there since the Manhattan Project, and that the people who run Los Alamos do not know about everything that's buried in the ground. Now, you say you've been to some of these old sites, you've seen some of these old burial grounds for nuclear waste?
I have been through the area that they currently bury waste in, and my assumption is they have probably buried waste in other areas of the site. It's not surprising that they don't. I think Mr. Hancock is probably correct.
He says littered.
Yes, past practices were very sloppy. Record keeping was very sloppy. The area that they currently bury in is a ridge that is just chock full of waste. The whole ridge is just jam-packed with waste.
Well, evidently now some of this is so. Now you've just gotten back from Washington. We're airing this program, over the next 4 days, and I talked to Sheriff Epp, that we have nothing in Boulder County right now that's monitoring our air, so we know what kind of nuclear particulates are being suspended in our own air. Even as we speak on Thursday night, nobody in the damn state has been following this, or unless, do you know? I mean, is anybody on top of this thing up here?
As you know, I just got back from Washington, D.C., and so I'm not sure what is happening here. One of the issues that everybody should be aware of is that this fire began with a controlled burn at Bandelier National Park.
Yep.
Very recently, They were talking about doing a controlled burn at the Rocky Flats plant, and they actually did a 50-acre test burn. One of the questions we always raised was, what happens if that controlled burn gets out of control and sweeps across the site?
And the guy that started this fire down there, they relieved him of his position today. The Weather Service sent him the highest fire danger rating when he asked for it, and he went and started the controlled burning in the worst possible weather. So the man who started the controlled burn is a complete idiot, for one. Also, that's forest area. Rocky Flats is grassland.
That's correct.
So it would be a little less.
From what we have been told by public interest organizations who work on the Los Alamos National Laboratory, in the past they have tried to do burns like this in the area, and they did not feel that they were successful because the area was wetter than they would like, so they evidently decided to do it when it was as dry as it could possibly be.
All right, Tom, let's talk worst possible scenario. Okay, we already know that some of these storage areas or dump sites for nuclear waste have already burned. We already know that there is that in around Santa Fe and Los Alamos, the REM rating or RIM rating is 3 times what it is normally, which would be 3 times what, say, the sun would put out, right? But let's say worst possible scenario, that we're not being told the truth, that more nuclear wastes are burning. What do you do if you live in Boulder and you want to protect yourself from something you're not being told by the government? I mean, my responsibility to the community is to tell them what they ought to be doing. I don't want to, be on television, have this kind of information, and not tell a worst possible scenario to the people of our town. And we all know about Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, but certainly Chernobyl, where the Russians lied to everybody for a long time, and a lot of people got sick and died. So what do you do now? Let's say worst possible scenario. Nobody's on top of this. Nobody really knows what's in the air, but we know something's in the air. What do you do to protect yourself?
Well, with Chernobyl, it was not only the Russians that lied. Most of the governments in the world lied about what was coming across in plumes, including the U.S. government. And so it's quite possible we're not getting the truth.
Well, we know that. We already know that, if they lied at Rocky Flats, they're lying at Los Alamos.
So what happens at this point?
What do you do now?
If there's contamination actually coming through this area, there is not a lot that any person could do. I think that what is important is to really find out what is being released from Los Alamos, B, where is it going, in what direction is it going, and how does the fallout from the plume?
Well, it's westerly. We know they're westerly prevailing winds, so it's going, but it is hitting southern Colorado. But yesterday you could smell smoke in Boulder and Denver. So I'm going to ask you again, worst possible scenario, if there's bad stuff in the air that can hurt people, what should people in Boulder do?
There's not much you can do here unless you want to leave.
Okay.
There's nothing you can really do to protect yourself. What we're talking about are very, very small particulates.
You can't be in an air-conditioned house? That won't protect you?
A
sealed house?
I wouldn't say that would protect you. It's probably better to be indoors than to be outdoors, but I would not suggest that would be 100% protection.
Well, okay, here you go. Go in your basement at your workplace in Denver, one of those sealed-tight buildings. I'm serious,
Unfortunately,
Yeah.
We've created something that is very dangerous. Plutonium is very dangerous. Highly enriched uranium is very dangerous.